Well, it's not contagious. It's kind of, you kind of bring it on yourself when like me, most of your vehicles are by design 25 to 30 years old. It kind of. Yeah. My Honda out there, has 250,000 miles. And I, kind of baby it, don't zoom around it or anything. Yeah.
Well, I'm not there yet. I'm on that 240 on one, 230 on the other. I said I only have 240 on one and 230 on the other.
And Rebecca and I won't be here Sunday either.
Oh, wow.
We're leaving Friday morning to go to my granddaughter's graduation party on Saturday. And then we're going to go to worship service in Watsonville and then drive back.
And I may.
Okay. Yeah, okay. I thought you were going to be over.
Well, I was going to, but she said, well, we got plenty of time.
Okay. All right. For those that may not have heard, Thorpe's will be out of town again this weekend, and then the Abates will also be out of town. The Woods may be back. We'll be here.
Yay!
As far as I know. So we got some travelers, and for those that may or may not have seen on the via text, but Carolyn and Jimmy did make it to Washington safely. And speaking of car troubles, but glad that they made it safe. And are there any other announcements or prayer requests? Well, I'm glad to hear, I guess, that there's nothing that's overly urgent or pressing. I mean, of course, we still have several on the prayer list that are dealing with some serious health issues and ongoing things, but at least, nothing new. So hopefully that means folks are healing and things are progressing. So, David, do you have a song picked out? Okay. Oh, you have a printout. Do we need to hand it out then?
Stand in front of the camera awkwardly. All right.
I don't know if that would work or not.
I'm very good at standing here awkwardly. All right. For those online, the song we're singing tonight is a new printout. The song title is called We Bow Down. We Bow Down. You are King of creation and Lord of my life, Lord of the land and the sea. You were Lord of the heavens before there was time, and Lord of all lords you will be. We bow down and we worship you, Lord. We bow down and we worship you, Lord. We bow down and we worship you, Lord. Lord of all lords you will be. You are King of creation and King of my life, King of the land and the sea. You were King of the heavens before there was time, and King of all kings you will be. We bow down and we crown you the King. We bow down and we crown you the King. We bow down and we crown you the King, King of all and for those that are online and are interested, there are more copies. So we'll share them around again in the future, I'm sure. All right, let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer. Our Lord and our Father, we are grateful and thankful to you for all the ways that you have blessed us. We thank you for the opportunity to gather here in your name and to glorify you in these songs and to study from your word. We thank you for attuning yourself to our prayers and hearing all of our burdens. And we place them, Lord, at your feet, knowing that that is what you desire for us to do. We're mindful, Father, of many who are about to be traveling, and we're thankful for those that have made safe journey. And we pray, Father, that you will continue to watch over them. Be the many who are on our prayer list who are struggling with various health problems, some long-term, some recovering from major surgeries, some dealing with chronic illnesses. And we pray, Father, your hand be upon them. Please, Lord, as we turn our attention again tonight to your servant Joseph, help us as we strive to learn from his example and learn from his leadership. We thank you, Father, for all things in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so in Genesis chapter 42, we see that the famine, again, as we closed out last week talking about the close of chapter 41, that the famine had expanded outside of Egypt and was now affecting most of, if not the entirety of the Mediterranean world. And so, due to this, Jacob sends his 10 sons, only 10. Because remember, as far as he knows, Joseph is dead and he does not allow Benjamin to go. He keeps Benjamin back, kind of indicating, although it may not be said outright, that Benjamin had essentially taken the place of Joseph as his father's favorite. He's quoted in verse 4 as saying, "I'm afraid that harm may befall him." Now, this doesn't necessarily and shouldn't necessarily indicate that he thought that the brothers necessarily had anything to do with Joseph. I think it's just he couldn't stand the thought of losing his last connection to Rachel. Couldn't stand the thought of losing that entire part of his family. And so the brothers come down and Joseph receives them. Now, I thought that was an interesting parallel that Brother Michael Whitworth in his commentary and study on this that he draws, and that is, I find it interesting because he references one of my favorite books of all time, The Count of Monte Cristo, of revenge and also the fact that revenge doesn't always get you what you think it's going to get you is really the ultimate lesson of the book. And I do see this I agree with Brother Whitworth that it seems that this is the path that Joseph begins down. He seemingly, I wouldn't say torture, as in he doesn't necessarily physically harm his brothers, but he certainly treats them harshly, even goes so far as to accuse them of being spies, has them imprisoned for 3 days, and basically says that he's not going to release them unless they can produce Benjamin. He then recants that very quickly, and things change. And I think what's interesting about this is one of the few times that we see Joseph not behaving quite like Joseph. It would seem that at first, seeing his brothers, and it does say in verse 9 and following that he remembers his dreams and things, and this maybe seems to kind of fuel a fire within him. Because again, as much as he has demonstrated a strength of character and things, I also think it would be very hard to be confronted with a little over 20 years. And in fact, I think that speaks a lot for itself, that here, now as he's nearly 40 years old, he's seemingly unrecognizable to his own brethren.
Well, you got to remember, he's not in his ordinary clothes, now he's in
He would, yeah,
royal garb.
he would be dressed as an Egyptian, most likely would have had his hair, beard, potentially even some makeup and things that were commonplace in Egyptian society. He would not have looked exactly like a Hebrew. But even then, I mean, we can see people that we know and, generally recognize him. But again, going from 17 years in adolescence to now, again, an almost 40-year-old individual, our bodies change a lot, don't they? Our faces change a lot. And it does seem, Joseph specifically does say, it does say that in verse 7 that he somewhat disguised himself. And so it could be that he intentionally was not giving them maybe a full view of his face. It could be, and he does use an interpreter to speak to them. Of course, he doesn't need one, but they don't know that. And so he could be using these layers. And he does seem to be using, I shouldn't say that. He is using these layers intentionally to kind of disguise himself even further than maybe the natural aging process might have done on its own. He accuses them of being spies. It's an interesting phrase that he uses here, or that in verses 9 and verse 12, both times he says that they have come to spy out the nakedness of the land. At least that's the literal translation. But this is most likely a Hebrew idiom. That is, it's kind of a turn of phrase. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're trying to find bare pieces of earth, but rather they're trying to find the unprotected. In fact, the New American Standard translates it that way, that they are looking for the undefended parts of the land. In other words, what he's saying is they're there to try to see if they can find where all the grain, where all the food is stored. They can find, because again, if they don't have to buy it, if they can just steal it,
I'm pretty sure it was pretty well guarded.
And I'm pretty sure it was pretty well guarded, as well as being most likely not just the giant silo that everybody knew exactly what it was. But again, this is what he accuses them of. And, it falls in line with what they might have expected, to be perfectly honest. Again, they are foreigners. There's 10 of them. And, when questioned about their family, they do tell him that they have another brother who stayed behind, and they say another brother that is dead, but their father is alive. And, that's a lot of detail, right? And he does ask specific questions, but
I think he wants to see how truthful they are. So, like you said, the verse before, it's like they bowed down and everything. I'm sure they didn't want to make eye contact with them. So that was part of the reason why. Right.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying that right here in this, that was why his brothers didn't recognize him. That too.
yeah, there's a level of respect and even fear at a certain point that they would have shown. So then he imprisoned them for 3 days, and then he comes back and he says, okay, I'm not going to leave you all here, but I am going to keep one of you behind, and you will not see me again. You cannot come back and expect to see me. You cannot come back and expect to buy grain, essentially is what he's saying, unless you bring your last brother. And so here we see Reuben speaking up in verse 22 as they're kind of standing there. And he says, I told you not to sin against the boy. Now comes the reckoning for his blood. Now, Joseph, of course, understands what they're saying, right? But they don't know that. They think that they're essentially having a private conversation because they assume that he can't speak Hebrew. But we see here in verse 24 kind of the breaking down of whatever wall Joseph had. As upon hearing this, he breaks down and he weeps. Then he comes back and he takes Simeon from them and binds them before their eyes. So seemingly hearing Reuben make this statement, he then picks the next oldest, allows Reuben to maybe go, picks Simeon and takes him into imprisonment. Now, we're not told anything about Simeon's imprisonment. But I don't really think that he was, chained to a wall, given, nothing but gruel and dirty water, right? He would have had to have been in some sort of confinement. Otherwise, he might have become suspicious as to what was going on. But I have a feeling that Joseph was taking care of his brother, even as this. And again, what he does for his brothers in verses 25 and following, and not only giving them the grain that they requested, but giving them back their money, shows, of course, that he's trying to take care of his family here. And so, very quickly, and realistically, in the span of about 3 days, it would seem that the Monte Cristo arc of Joseph is already done. He's toyed with them, toyed with their emotions a little bit, and doesn't seem to have a taste for it. And again, his weeping becomes a common theme throughout this as he's confronted with the emotions of seeing his family. But again, really from here out, we get quickly back to Joseph, the normal Joseph. He still has to kind of play along a little bit. If nothing else, there has to be some pretext for the Egyptians. But he no longer treats them very harshly and certainly doesn't throw them back in prison.
See, okay, so I've always, in my head, there's nothing to substantiate this, but in my head, I've always looked at it as Joseph feeling his brothers out after not knowing what kind of lives they've led after they sold them into slavery. And feeling them out to see if his younger brother is still alive, or did they do the same thing to him? How can I secure his safe passage to me and bring him to me to protect his brother? But I mean, there's nothing in here that says he's doing it to protect his brother, but that's in my head how I've always looked at it.
And another thing that comes up both here and then in the next is he leads with, "How is your father?" And he's very concerned about their father. And that's going to, of course, come up in the next section, in this next meeting, when Judah, again, is brought back into the limelight and shows himself to be the leader that God wants him to be in a lot of ways. And so again, he sends them on their way, but again commands them, "Look, your brother's going to stay here in prison until you come back with your younger brother. Go." And so they go, and then they are scared a lot when they find their money still in the sacks. And not just one or two, but all of them, all 9 that return, have all of their money back and the grain. And then in chapter 43... let's talk this a little bit here at the end of chapter 42. Reuben speaks to his father and says, "Let me take the boy back. We're out of grain. We need more. Let me take the boy." He even says that Jacob could kill his sons if he didn't bring his brother back. But Jacob refuses and says that if he goes, if anything was to happen to him, it would bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow. And so it seems a lot like for the last 22 years, poor Jacob has been holding on by a thread.
Well, he has to, because he hasn't fulfilled the dream yet.
He hasn't fulfilled the dream yet, but it just seems like there's... Joseph's death, or at least his understanding that Joseph is dead, seems to have affected him for a long time. And I want to point this out because I think we sometimes in our society especially I've even heard people tell people to get over the death of a loved one. there's no getting over the death of a loved one. Not especially a loved one that you're very close to, or, you know, in this context, you know, that Jacob very much doted on his son. There's no getting over that. You can learn to move through it and with the weight of the grief, but nowhere does anybody mock, chastise, rebuke, in any way feel that what Jacob has gone through for 22 years is in any way wrong. And I think that's an important lesson for us to learn as well, that grief may linger for a lifetime, and that's okay. So then we get to chapter 43, and even though they've not had a whole lot of food, they still haven't gone back down because they know they can't go without Benjamin. So then we have Judah speak up and tell his brother, look, the guy said we will not even see his face. We will not get more grain unless Benjamin goes with us. And in an interesting change here, instead of, for example, offering his own children, he puts himself on the line. He says, you can hold me personally responsible if anything happens to the boy. And Jacob, why did you tell him about your brother? And he said, the man asked us specifically. We couldn't lie to him. He already thought we were spies. But he says, I will be his surety. I will be responsible. And I love verse 10, because he does kind of chastise his father here. But it might be the push that his father needed at this time. He says, if we had not delayed, surely by now we could have gone and returned twice. He's saying, our family is hurting because of what you are refusing to do. He's essentially telling Israel that you are putting Benjamin ahead of the entire rest of the family. Not just playing favorites, you are putting the rest of the family's lives at risk, because obviously you can't live very long without food.
That always seems strange to me because they had lots of sheep.
But we're not built to eat just meat. Regardless of what some people might tell you.
And maybe if there was a famine, the sheep didn't have much to eat.
Yeah. If in a famine, the sheep aren't going to have very much to eat, and you know that's going to affect how many lambs you get. It's going to affect a lot of that kind of stuff. So, but yeah, they needed the grain for sure, and so finally, Israel or Jacob says, "Fine, go," and he tells them, "But take double money and take a present." He sends them with pistachio nuts, almonds, myrrh, balm, some honey, things that were commonplace in Canaan, but weren't commonplace in Egypt, right? Not a care package. This is a please don't hate us package. We're not spies, we promise. And again, the double money to pay for what they felt they stole the first time, in essence, as well as the new grain. And so then they come, and Joseph saw Benjamin, and he sees them, and he tells them to take them to his house, and get them ready for a shared meal, a shared lunch, essentially, or what we would call lunch. And the brothers are kind of shocked by this because, of course, they're expecting to have to do what they did last time, wait in line, go into the great hall, bow before him and all of these things. Instead, they're kind of shuffled by his servants into his own home and told that they are to prepare themselves to eat with him. And immediately they imagine in verse 18 that this is because of the money. They're very paranoid. And yet at the same time, even we saw, Reuben's statements and things, as much as their father has been dealing with grief for 20 years, these brothers have been dealing with guilt. and it's making them a little bit paranoid. You know, and so they're very worried and things. And so when Joseph's steward comes to them, they say, well, they give this whole story. We found the money in our sacks, and we don't know what's going on, and hoping that maybe the steward can talk to Joseph and not have them killed. And so he tells them, don't worry, be at ease. Your God, and I love this in verse 23, your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money. And then he brings out Simeon to join them. And so they can have absolutely no idea what to expect right now. Right? This guy's speaking about their God and the God of their fathers, which undoubtedly the servant was told what to say. But now their brother's out of prison and he's with them. And kind of maybe one more little thing to do to kind of mess with their minds. When Joseph gets there, he sits them down by birth order. And it says that they're astonished by this, which of course they would be, right? Because how would he know exactly how to line up all 11 brothers perfectly by birth order?
The way he looked. Of course, it all depends on your lifestyle too, because I had one brother that smoked, and he died at 57, and he looked older at 57 than I do.
Brothers looked a little older than they should because, again, of all the guilt and things that they were carrying. They were carrying a lot on their shoulders, as we've already seen. Now we're also shown here something in verse 32 that. So Bill says, did Joseph lie a little saying God gave them the money, but Joseph had their money? Joseph didn't say he had the money. The servant said he had the money. But no, I mean, I don't think he was lying in saying that God gave them the money, because as Joseph is about to tell them, Joseph fully believes that God put him in that position to not only provide for the family, but to give them the grain and the authority to not only give them the grain, but to give them their money back and have nobody question him. And so in that way, it's not a lie at all, because Joseph absolutely feels that God has made this all possible, and God has. And so he was saying, essentially he's saying, look, I had your money, I gave it back. You didn't not give me the money, I just gave it back. In addition to seating them from oldest to youngest, he gives Benjamin 5 times the portions of everybody else. There's not the amazement at that, but they do share this meal. But what I was going to point out is in verse 32, we have some foreshadowing here that the Egyptians would not eat with the Hebrews. This is there's multiple parts to this. Number one, the Egyptians were absolutely xenophobic. They hated foreigners. They thought all foreigners, not unlike the Greeks, not unlike the Romans, if you weren't one of them, you weren't anybody. But also, there's some religious things to this. Not unlike, for example, modern-day Hindus, Egyptians felt that certain animals, like cows and sheep, were sacred, and they did not eat them. Now, that's not that they didn't eat meat, they just didn't eat certain animals. But once again, just as a reminder, what was the profession of the Hebrew people, basically going all the way back to before Abraham even? They were shepherds. They raised animals, and they didn't raise them as pets.
Joseph even tell them, don't tell Pharaoh that you're shepherds, but that's what they did.
Mm-hmm. But this also is, as I said, some foreshadowing. because people often question, well, why would Pharaoh give the land of Goshen to the Israelites? If you're not aware of the geography, the land of Goshen would have been basically some of the best pasture land in all of Egypt, because it's in the middle of the Nile Delta. But that's exactly why the Egyptians gave it to them, is because they couldn't stand being around people who not only raised those animals, but killed them and ate them. The Egyptians were not ranchers. They were farmers, and they did, fish from the Nile and do things of that nature, but they didn't raise herd animals, not herd crops, herd animals. And so separating them out, and of course Joseph has some power in this, but sending them away kind of out of sight, out of mind, Pharaoh would have been very happy with that. Because the Egyptians, even though it worked out perfectly for the Israelites because of their profession and things, the Egyptians wouldn't have seen the same value in that land. Because with all of the flooding and things that happened there, it wasn't good for farming. It wasn't good for how they lived. And so, we have to look at that. Sometimes, again, we see things, I'll use myself as an example in this. I look at an old, maybe slightly rusty old Ford pickup truck, and I want to save it. You might look at the same truck and go, that thing needs to go to the scrapyard. We don't always see the world in the same way, but that doesn't mean that we see it wrongly. The Egyptians didn't see a lot of value to the land of Goshen, and were happy to keep the Israelites kind of segregated there, because that particular plot of land didn't have the value for them. And there's some foreshadowing to this, that even in Joseph's household. Now think about that. Everybody knows who Joseph is in Egypt. Nobody's ever pretended, yes, he has an Egyptian name, yes, he has an Egyptian wife, but it's never been a secret that Joseph is not an Egyptian. And so I have to wonder, did Joseph's own servants not eat with him?
Well, it appears that he ate by himself.
Just kind of one of those things that if the Egyptians refused to break bread with the Hebrews, was that only because there were all of these Hebrews, or did they treat Joseph that same way for 20 years? Even as he is second in command only to Pharaoh. Interesting. I don't have an answer for that, by the way. Just kind of something to think about. All right. So, Joseph again kind of plays a trick on his brothers. Fills their sacks with grain, puts the money back, but he also then says to put his silver cups, his silver chalice, in Benjamin's bag specifically. Brothers are sent out. Joseph then sends armed guards after them, accusing them of theft, and they find it in Benjamin's sack, and they tear their clothes, and they all come back to the city because, well, they know that they can't go back without Benjamin. So they tear their clothes. This again, remember, anytime you see somebody in this kind of context tear their clothes, they've gone into mourning. The brothers are already not only mourning potentially the loss of Benjamin, but they know what the loss of Benjamin will do to their father. They have already begun the process of mourning. And so they come back, and then in verse 14, we see Judah again take this leadership role, and he says, please, and I love this, it says, when Judah and his brothers come back to Joseph's house. Who's leading? It's not Reuben, it's not Simeon, it's not Levi, it's Judah. And it's Judah that speaks up and essentially says, if you do this, if you are so angry with us and you do this thing, you will kill our father. If we can't take our brother back, he will die. And then he goes on and he tells the story about how it took so much convincing for Benjamin to come. And it reiterates over and over again that if he does not see Benjamin, he will die. And then that becomes too much. In chapter 45, Joseph no longer can control himself, and he sends everybody out of the room. All the servants, all the Egyptians, everybody but him and his brothers. And he cries. And he cries so loudly that it says that those of Pharaoh's household heard it. So they obviously know something's going on, right? And then Joseph turns to his brothers and finally reveals himself. He says, "It is I, Joseph." And their reaction is not exactly relief. In fact, in verse 3 of chapter 45, it says they were dismayed. They thought, now we've really had... You see here, think from their position, right? They're dealing with an angry ruler of a foreign nation. Oh no. Not just an angry ruler of a foreign nation, the brother that we sold into slavery 20 years ago. And here's where Joseph acknowledges that God is the one that sent him down. They meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, and he was able to save their family, able to save, all of these people's lives. Of course, not just their family, but obviously Joseph's actions and his rule saved potentially millions of lives, right? Because there was grain to have and to sell and to eat, not just for the Hebrews, but for all of the land of Egypt and other countries and other places. And so he tells them that they can come down and live in the land of Goshen, and he will provide for them because he tells them there's 5 more years of famine coming. And I love how he just says that. And he doesn't seem to need to explain anything, and his brothers probably know why, right? Why Joseph would not need to explain how he knows that there's 5 more years of famine. Because undoubtedly, they're now thinking back to the first time that they met Joseph and had to bow down to him, and undoubtedly the dreams are coming back to them too. And so you have to go home, tell our father of the splendor, and it says that he kissed them and he wept on them, and afterward his brothers talked with him. And I love verse 16 because it shows this relationship, okay? And it shows how being a person of integrity and being, a Christian, at this point a follower of God, not specifically Christian, can endear ourselves to people that might be surprising that we would be endeared to. Because verse 16 tells us that when Pharaoh heard about Joseph's brothers, it pleased him and his whole household. As much as Pharaoh seemingly loved Joseph, as much as Pharaoh, again, gave him this title and gave him a wife and all of these things, undoubtedly Pharaoh also knew that he was a man out of place, right? And so for his place to now come to him, I can't help but think over the last several years, right? Over the last years of Joseph providing for Egypt and bringing in all of the things during the 7 years of plenty, and now 2 years into the famine, still providing for his nation and making Pharaoh rich and powerful beyond his wildest imaginations. Pharaoh has a lot of affection for Joseph and is glad to see that he is happy. And that is so amazing to me when we see this. And again, it's Pharaoh's idea to send the wagons and bring everything and everybody down, right? And yes, you'll have, the land of Egypt will welcome you. I mean, just take a moment, right? It's one thing for Pharaoh to say, yeah, go ahead, give him some grain. It's a whole other thing for Pharaoh to go, yeah, bring them all down, and we're going to give you this section of the nation, and it's going to be yours. That says a lot, again, about not only Pharaoh, but the relationship that Joseph had been able to build with him. And to me, this shows that it was more than simply the guy who's making me rich.
It had to be because as a leader of the nation, knowing what he knows about the famine's continuation even after this, Pharaoh logically should have been like, yeah, we don't need more mouths to feed. But he welcomes the whole family.
Well, and it is important for us to remember, we're not just talking about the 11 brothers and and their father, right? There's wives, there's children, there's servants, there's mouths to feed beyond just the immediate family.
But Joseph has well prepared.
Joseph has well prepared, and I think again that kind of, I especially love verse 20. Do not concern yourself with your goods, for the best of the land of Egypt is yours. And that's Pharaoh to the brothers. And so the sons of Israel go, and they go, and I love verse 24 also. As Joseph is sending them away, he says, "Don't fight on the way home." Seemingly fighting on road trips is apparently cross-generational, cross-cultural, spans all time. But at the same time, I think this is some wisdom, right? Because it'd be easy, right, for Reuben to see, we shouldn't, I didn't want to sell him, and it'd be easy for, this backbiting about all of what has happened, right? But Joseph just wants them to understand that this happened because God wanted it to happen. It's okay. And they come back, of course, and they tell their father that Joseph is alive and he's ruler over the land of Egypt. And of course he doesn't believe them, because why would he? Right? Here, he's been mourning for over 20 years the death of his son. And not just to hear that he's actually alive, but he's the ruler of a foreign land. What? But again, they keep after him, and they finally convince him. And I love what he says in verse 28. It is enough that my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. He doesn't care about the title. He doesn't care about the ruler of all of Egypt. He just wants to see his son again before he dies. And so then we get to chapter 46, and this represents kind of another shift here. As this is, remember, as we think about who this was originally written for, right? This is originally written for the Israelites as a reminder of where they come from. So chapter 46 and verse 1, that's pivotal to who they are as a people, standing at the base of Mount Sinai. As Moses receives the law, as Moses writes these books. By the way, in case you weren't aware, they were at Mount Sinai for at least 3 years, because they celebrated Passover 3 times at Mount Sinai before they moved on. And so, I think sometimes we think God comes down on the mountain, they get the law, they get the tablets, they take off. Nope, they were there for a while. And again, Moses is writing this record, and so this is telling them quite literally why they just had to leave Egypt. Why were they there in the first place, right? Well, here it is. This is I don't know, this is just a key to being who they are. Okay? And so Israel comes to Egypt, and of course, obviously Israel the man, but also Israel the nation, right? And in fact, as they're journeying, they come to Beersheba, and he offers sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. That's an interesting turn of phrase, right? How do people refer to Jehovah moving forward? He's the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. But here, intentionally, it says that Jacob was offering sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Even though he's already been shown so many things, right? God has appeared to him twice already. He's wrestled with God. He's had his name changed. He's not yet, at least maybe in his own eyes, fully there to being the patriarch that he sees his father, that he sees his grandfather being. But again, God comes to him in visions, and he tells him one more time, don't be afraid to go to Egypt. I'm going to make you a great nation. And I will not only go down with you, but I will bring you up, and Joseph will close your eyes. Now that's a very personal promise, that of course he would see his son before his death, but also that his son would be there for his death. And so then Jacob arose, and they go down, they take all that they have, their livestock and property and all of these things, and they come down to Egypt. And then in verses 8 and following, we have a listing of everybody that comes down. And it was 70 people, according to verse 27. 70 people. That's actually a lot, right? When you just go back 2 generations and look at Abraham and Sarah, right? And having one child together at 190. And your family has grown so much in just 2 generations that now 70 people who are considered Hebrews, 70 people who are considered Israelites. Now, this number is not necessarily all-inclusive, by the way. It may not take into account household like servants and slaves and things, but 70 people who would be considered the descendants of Abraham, so to speak.
I was also going to say, this being written for the Israelites at the base of Mount Sinai, the scale between how it started and where it went is massive.
Yeah, it's estimated by many commentators that when Israel left Egypt, they were probably in the neighborhood of 2 million strong. That's kind of a middle-of-the-road estimate. But from 70 to 2 million.
400 years.
400 years. But again, right here, as they again hear one more time of God appearing to Jacob and saying, I'm going to make you a nation, they, the nation, are hearing this. They're hearing how God, and remember, these are people who, from the time that they crossed the Red Sea, begin to have issues with God. And so, again, God is emphasizing these things to remind them that he has kept his word every step of the way. He kept his word with Abraham. He kept his word with Isaac. He kept his word with Jacob. He kept his word with Joseph. And he will keep his word with them as well. Because yes, they are the same peoples. They share the genetics and all of these things. But again, it is 400 years in Egypt. It's not the same people, right? They've been influenced by the Egyptians for a long time, right? Even as we see them struggle with idolatry and things of that nature, even while at Mount Sinai. But again, trying to remind them of where they came from. Excuse me. Undoubtedly, there were people coming out of Egypt whose families numbered larger than the entire nation did when it went into Egypt.
Kind of on the subject, but since it's called Benjamin the lad, I wonder about how old anybody knows what age he would be, because Joseph was gone for 22 years.
I'm trying to remember how, if it ever said how old the other brothers were when Benjamin was born. He was born much later. He was considerably younger than In fact, the text seems to indicate, for example, that Reuben already had begun his family, already had a wife and children before Benjamin was born. But remember, the term youth or lad in Hebrew applies to somebody into their late 20s. And so it's very possible that he's still maybe not quite 30 years old, but he's otherwise a grown person.
They did, could go into the military at 20.
Yep.
That's where the counting started.
Mhm. Yep.
20. I think what, 60?
Well, Joseph was 40, so his brothers must have been 50, 60.
Yeah, we're not told the exact spread of age, but also remember people were living longer, right? Even though Israel decries that he didn't live to the age of his forefathers, he still lived well over 100 years.
And because of how his brothers and him were born, it wasn't just one woman having all of them. It was 4 different women concurrently.
Mhm.
So there wouldn't have been a huge spread
Yeah.
necessarily.
There was a bit of a gap between. Well, there was a gap even between Joseph and Benjamin. But beyond that, the other brothers, and there was a gap between Joseph and his brothers, his older brothers as well, because God made it that way. But yeah, the other brothers may not have had a huge gap between them.
And that's partly why Israel showed Joseph favoritism in the first place. It said because he was the youngest in his later years.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so they come, and Joseph goes in his chariot and goes up to Goshen and sees his father. And in verse 29 it says, he fell on his neck and he wept on his neck for a long time. Obviously, words were spoken eventually, but no words needed at their first meeting in 20 plus years. And at the same time, I'm not really sure that I would want to hear what Joseph or what Jacob immediately says. I've seen you, let me die. Whoa, Dad. A little bit dramatic there, but he's not actively saying I want to die. He's saying I can die happy now. I've seen you again. And so then they go to the land. He brings his brothers and his father to Pharaoh, and tells Pharaoh that they are shepherds, they're keepers of livestock, and they've brought their flocks and herds. And they go to the land of Goshen, and it says there at the end of chapter 46, "For every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians." And so even though, again, Pharaoh would have found their chosen occupation distasteful, he's still good to them because of his relationship with Joseph. And so they go to Pharaoh. He takes 5 of his brothers with him and kind of presents them to Pharaoh. And they kind of ask, "We've come to sojourn in the land, for there's no pasture in Canaan." And Pharaoh gives them the land of Goshen officially. And so Joseph brings his father Jacob and presents him to Pharaoh. And this is where we find out in verse 9 that he's 130 at the current time. And this is when he says he has not attained the years that his father lived during their sojourning. And then I love verse 10. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. What an interesting relationship, right? Because here you would think that it would be entirely the other way around, right? Pharaoh's the one in power. He's the one giving them the land of Goshen. He's giving them, all of these things, and yet it is Jacob that blesses Pharaoh. Penny asks, what were the religious practices of the Israelites at this time? They were, the reason that we call it the patriarchal period is they were followers of God, whatever that was. They did offer animal sacrifices. Generally speaking, those animal sacrifices were the task of the father or the oldest male relative, why we call it the patriarchal system. And so it was Abraham, then it would have been Isaac, now it is Jacob, which is why we see Jacob offering the sacrifices. And so again, basically that's how it worked, and continued to work at a certain level. Even once the Levites were in place in the book of Exodus, it still was very much run by the oldest male relative of each tribe. For example, was a representative to Moses, was a representative later to the judges, was later representatives to the kings. And so, this system of the oldest male relative is kind of a Hebrew thing. It's not exclusively, of course, but that's kind of how their religious practices worked. Remember, even the law, which hasn't been given yet, very different in its religious practices to what we are used to. They had very specific feast and festival days and things of that nature, but by and large, in their day-to-day, there weren't, quote, religious practices as we see them. Yes, they would have had tithings, and yes, they would have had prayers and things of this nature, but they didn't, for example, there's nowhere in the law for a weekly assembly, for example. Their calendars were really based around those, starting out with 4 major feast days, but expanding throughout time. That's really how their practices worked, and seemingly it was something not dissimilar, even though not exactly the same. Obviously, we see Noah worship as soon as he gets off the ark, right? We see just in Jacob's life, we've seen him after his encounters with God, often either building an altar or building some sort of monument, either offering sacrifices or pouring oil on it, things of that nature.
So Garrett, that's one of the reasons we asked the question. That's obviously what Jacob did at Beersheba when they start heading out.
Mm-hmm.
But the question is, Joseph, all that time he's in Egypt, was he doing anything like that that would have identified him as Hebrew?
I don't know if you would have necessarily offered sacrifices in the same way, because this is actually this becomes not only here, but during the Exodus that becomes a big issue, because again, the idea of offering animal sacrifices, and specifically the bull, the cows and the goats and sheep, was extremely distasteful to the Egyptians. And so it very well could be that Joseph did not practice, not dissimilar to what we see in books like Daniel, or even before the temple's rebuilt in Ezra. During the captivity, the Israelites didn't worship, not because again their worships were very centered on specific things.
In Daniel's case, he did pray towards Jerusalem 3 times a day.
But again, when we think about Israelite worship, especially after Sinai, it had to be done at the tabernacle. It had to be done at the temple. There was no worship without those things. And while they didn't have that specific place like the tabernacle, like the temple, and during the patriarchal time, You know, chances are Joseph was not on a regular basis going out building altars and making animal sacrifices. Again, while it wasn't a secret that he was a Hebrew living in the land, they may not have just allowed him to have free reign to do whatever he wanted, because again, it would have been not just shocking, but borderline aggravating and insulting for him to do that, at least in the presence of the Egyptians. We're just not told if he, had opportunities to go out on his own and worship in those types of ways or to offer sacrifices. But obviously he maintained his faith. He obviously maintained a relationship with God one way or another that we're just not told about. Because again, what he says to his brothers, God has made this happen. But remember, Moses, when he goes to Pharaoh, says, let us go to the wilderness so that we can make sacrifice. Because the sacrificing of animals was not acceptable to the Egyptians.
Well, yeah, I was just gonna say that also under the patriarchal, we don't have the ins and outs of it, but it does seem to be much more, or much less rigid than the Levitical law.
Yeah, the patriarchal law seemed to have been much, if you didn't hear Linda, seemed to be much less rigid as far as, not having specific feast days that we're told about, not having a specific place like the temple or tabernacle. And it seemed to certainly revolve around moments where God not just interacted, but blessed. Yes, obviously when God did interact, we see that as a pretty common thing of making like I said, a monument or an altar and making a sacrifice or something. But, also, like a Thanksgiving type offering. Remember, they didn't really have tithing or anything like that before either. Because there wasn't a priesthood to give tithes to before the Levitical law. But it was. I guess the best way that you could probably describe worship during the time of the patriarchs was an echo of the Levitical system. Shared a lot of similarities, but it certainly was not the Levitical system. The Levitical system was certainly born out of some of those practices, but it was not merely a ratification of them. It itself was something different, in the same way that Christianity is not just an outgrowth of Judaism, even though we do share some commonalities, right? And we do share this common background even. So we have to be careful when we think about these things in Genesis, because we don't have a lot of information. And so we shouldn't necessarily think it's Leviticus light necessarily, but it's going to look a lot more like Leviticus than it is, for example, what we're used to as Christians. And of course, the other problem that we have from an archaeological standpoint is, what were the Hebrew people 100% forbidden from doing when it came to their religious practices?
There's several.
But they weren't allowed to, for example, make monuments and engrave things with the name of God or any kind of image that was supposed to depict God. And so guess what we don't have a whole lot of archaeologically? We don't have a bunch of stuff that says, oh, this is how the Israelites worshipped. Because they couldn't do those things. The reason that we can make some guesses and assumptions about the way other ancient cultures worshipped is because, well, they left behind relics. They left behind bits and pieces of things that they had made, and, inscriptions that they had made, praising. But again, the Israelites, by and large, did not even write the name of God. And in fact, the reason that we don't actually know how his name is pronounced is because it got to a point they stopped saying the name of God aloud. And so, it's kind of one of those things that we kind of just have to piece together some things from not only the book of Genesis, but also somewhat from the book of Exodus, because of course there is a portion of the book of Exodus that happens before Sinai. So, yeah, that's about the best I can answer that question as to their religious practices at this time, because we just don't know a whole lot.
It's kind of odd in chapter 46, that he tells Pharaoh that his family's house are shepherds, and then he tells him, his brothers tell them that you are, because they despise shepherds, you are, I lost the verse now. And then in chapter 47, they tell Pharaoh that they are shepherds. So he must be telling them when we're, in chapter 47, verse 3, he said, they say your servants are shepherds, both me and also our fathers. And basically that they need pasture for their flocks. And the famine was so bad in Canaan, that their flocks didn't have. But in chapter 46, says, verse 31, then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh and say to him, my brothers and those of my father's house who are within the land of Canaan. Oh, wait. Okay, I'm trying to find the shepherd's part.
Verse 32.
Okay. And the men are shepherds. So he tells Pharaoh they're shepherds, and then he tells them to refer to themselves as, they're in the business of livestock. And then in chapter 47, verse 3, they say, we are shepherds.
He tells them to tell Pharaoh that they're shepherds and keepers of livestock because he wants to give them the land of Goshen.
Oh, but we read that it said, was it 34? Occupation has been in livestock from our youth, because basically Egyptians hate shepherds.
Yeah, so Joseph wanted them to tell Pharaoh that they were shepherds because he knew that Pharaoh would want them out of sight, and the land of Goshen was out of sight.
But other than, it says, what is your occupation? You should answer your servants have tended livestock from boyhood, just as your fathers did, then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. So he's telling them not to tell them that they're shepherds, but that's what they tell them.
No, he tells them to tell them that they're keepers of livestock.
Yes, keepers of livestock, not shepherds.
It's the same.
It's the same thing. There's not that distinction.
Oh, so he wants them to specifically say that so that they can dwell in the land of Goshen.
Yes.
Because
Yep.
they want them away from him.
Yep.
Okay, so it's not a contradictory thing.
Nope. He tells them, tell Pharaoh what your job
tired,
is.
I'm just like,
No, you're fine.
that doesn't make sense.
No, he tells them, tell Pharaoh what your job is because then Pharaoh's going to want you away from him.
Oh, I see.
He's going to want you. You can ask for the land of Goshen and he'll give it to you because that's away from him.
And then it even secures them the ability to tend whatever other livestock that Pharaoh has, because not only are they shepherds to sheep, like that, we very specifically think sheep when we see shepherd, but they tend all sorts of livestock, and it guarantees them a place and a standing within the nation of Egypt that will go uncontested.
Yeah, the Egyptians are going to come for their jobs because the Egyptians don't want the job. The Egyptians don't want anything to do with sheep, goats, or cattle.
Just like people today don't want big pears.
Yeah. Like they're saying of the illegal people over the border. Well, who are going to have to clean houses?
But yeah, no, he tells them
What's
Huh?
It's not an okay thing to say.
he tells
Well, that's what Democrats say.
he tells He tells him to tell Pharaoh because again, Joseph already settled his family in Goshen because he knows that's where he wants them to be because it's a good pasture land. But he also knows he knows Pharaoh, and he knows that's why he trains them to what to say, because he knows what the magic words that are going to secure them the land of Goshen are going to be, and that is, we're keepers of livestock. We have sheep. We have cattle. We've not only do we have that, we've done that since our youth, and our fathers and our grandfather have done that. This is who we are. And Pharaoh's going to be like, I love Joseph, so you guys can stay, but you're going to stay over there.
Okay, so
That makes a lot more sense.
this is, I guess is confusing to me because, yes, Joseph goes to Pharaoh and tells him that they're shepherds.
Mhm.
But then he tells them to tell them that they have livestock from their youth.
Thomas
And-
is doing what I was
And
settling.
sheep or livestock.
Okay, I think I'm finally, it's kind of coming through.
'Cause at
It's
first-
because of how we think of things in English.
Well, it's the way it's worded.
Well, remember, it's not in English.
Well, it first makes
Okay.
you think he's saying, say this, it'll sound better to Joseph, to Pharaoh, because they hate shepherds, where he's saying what you said.
Well, it's
Tell them you've done this from youth, and that's your,
Well, they don't, and we have to remember, they don't just have sheep. They also have goats. They also have cattle. So the livestock thing is actually more truthful because they didn't just come with sheep. But
it's a little bit like the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. You know, depending on where you're from, you say, what do you mean you don't want the Lord?
Yeah.
You know?
and yeah. So again, keepers of livestock means keepers of animals, and specifically, it means keepers of the domesticated type of animals that the Egyptians want nothing to do with. It's not just keepers of animals. Pretty much everything that we consider to be a domesticated animal that we would keep for specifically food, the Egyptians didn't do that. They didn't want anything to do with that. They didn't want cows. They didn't want sheep. They didn't want goats. They had horses for their chariots, but that was a whole different thing. They also didn't eat them. So again, yeah, there's no contradiction, there's no lying. He's just telling them, if we do this, he's going to give us Goshen, and that's what we want. All right. Well, we're a little bit over, but that was a good discussion, and I'm glad we were able to work through that for everybody.